88.5 FM, KALA. I'm David Baker, and we have caught up with Betty Andrews, who is the president of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP State Area Conference of Branches, as well as Annie Maddie from Disability Rights Iowa. And I want to thank both of you for joining us on KALA. Let's talk midterm election. Both, thank you for being here on KALA.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Dave. We appreciate the invitation.
I guess the main question on our minds out here in the eastern part of the state is, what are the issues facing Iowa voters?
So just kind of to answer that question and kind of give just a little bit of history. And I know that, we have a little, we're a tight time, but I wanted to say that I think that this is a great partnership that we have, the NAACP with Disability Rights Iowa, because our constituents both have a history of being disenfranchised at times. And so to be able to talk about how to make sure that everyone has access to the polls is extremely important to us. And I think you'll find in our conversation, definitely there's a historical aspect of, dealing specifically with people of color and black people with the NAACP, where we have had a history in which we have had to fight against voter disenfranchisement to the point where we championed the Voters' Rights Act and continue as the NAACP to canvass and make sure that people are aware that they can vote, that there should not be barriers to their voting, and that if there are barriers or if there are challenges, for instance, this new voter ID law has got a lot of people sweating. And so if there are those types of barriers, that we educate our voters to make sure that they are aware of what is going on. Additionally, with the disabled population in Iowa being around 300,000 people, there are a number of barriers in which people are not aware that are affecting people with disabilities. And so that's why this partnership with Annie and Disability Rights is extremely important, because I think both groups, and not only both groups, but all Iowans really benefit from understanding what their rights are when it comes to voting. And as I said, we've recently gotten a new law. It's put a lot of fear in people, but the best way to combat fear is education. And so that's what we're here today to do.
I think that's a good point, Betty. And Annie, I want to direct this question to you about voting rights and disabilities. I think that Betty does have it correct. There's been a shared history of difficulty of people of color being able to vote, and disadvantaged communities as well as those with disabilities. And I just don't think there's been much of a conversation about those with disabilities and voting. And do you know why that is?
Well, oftentimes it's a out of sight, out of mind mentality, which is quite unfortunate when it revolves around the community, the disability community. And so I think that it's really great that we're partnering with the NAACP, because I think that marginalized communities really need to stand together to make sure that we have the best chance of equal access to our rights, especially voting, because oftentimes people outside of our communities will judge, especially in the disability community, people unfit to vote, even if they don't know that you have the right to vote unless it's been taken away by a whole separate court proceeding. So sometimes people just don't understand the eccentricities of our rights and the ways that we are able to exercise them.
Certainly. And my question is, what are the issues in Iowa right now? Either of you can take this, or maybe both might take a part of it. We are hearing a whole mixed bag out here in the eastern part of the state, but out in the center part of the state, what are you hearing in general? What are the issues facing voters in Iowa right now?
So I think the way we can answer that is just to kind of jump right in and talk about access issues and making sure that people have access to the polls. I know that the NAACP, you all know that the NAACP is a nonpartisan organization, as is Disability Rights Iowa. And so, our concern is that we, again, the NAACP on behalf of people of color and the DRI on behalf of the disabled community, that people's voices are allowed to be heard, that they are able to have a say in what things matter to them. And so in doing that, we've comprised a list of about 10 things to know about this upcoming election.
Okay.
And there, certainly we'll kind of jump in on those.
Sure.
And we'll,
Let's do
add
it.
to that. But the first thing that people should know is that the election is Tuesday, November 6th, from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. So polls are open throughout that day on Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. And if you are in line before the polls close, you have the right to vote. So that's a very easy issue. And certainly if you need to know where your polls are, please contact your Secretary of State's office, or I know that you'll be providing our websites a little bit later in the program as well. So, and then the other thing that we think is chief for all Iowans is to be aware that even though early registration closed last week, you can still register to vote and vote on the same day. So when you go to vote, you can actually vote because Iowa has same-day registration. So you can do that all on site there. And then, of course, I'm going to take this one and then I'm going to throw it to Annie to talk about some of the issues of accessibility. But Iowa has, of course, a new voter ID law, and that's important. But it's also important to know that for this year, which for 2018, which includes this upcoming midterm election, that people who don't have the specified identification can still vote. They just need to verify their identity and sign an oath that says that they are who they say they are. But beginning January 2019, voters are required to show one of the following types of identification. So we suggest that you just go ahead and start out now in showing these types of information. And just to kind of go through, those identification types include an Iowa driver's license, an Iowa non-operator's ID, a military ID, a U.S. passport, a tribal ID, a veteran's ID, and then also the voter ID card if you were one of the thousands of people that received it from the Iowa Secretary of State. And I do want to be clear that that's not a picture ID, but it is a valid voter card for identification purposes. If you do not, and again, after January 1st, 2019, if you do not have one of these types of ID, you will still be allowed to vote, but you would need to ask for a provisional ballot, which would allow you to vote and then verify with more information by the Monday following Election Day. And I know that's a lot of information, but it is really important to know your rights in terms of what you can do. So for this election, you are still able to vote without that ID. You just want to be prepared. And if you don't have that, you're still able to vote with the oath. But after January 2019, that does change. So, and with that, Annie, if one of the things that I've learned in this process is that a lot of times people think that if a person has a guardian or if someone thinks that they are unable to vote, that they can still vote.
Yes. No, it's a common misperception actually that adults with a guardian are not allowed to vote because they're under a guardianship, but that right to vote has to be taken away in a completely separate court proceeding. So adults with a guardian are still allowed to vote if they meet all the other requirements, if they're over 18, if they live in Iowa, and they have the necessary stuff after January 2019. So no one at the polls can challenge your capacity to vote if you have that right. A judge has to take that away. That's a whole different thing. That includes if you have some sort of speech difficulties, stuttering, or communication difficulties, if you have autism or Down syndrome. If you have a guardian, you can still vote. No one can tell you that you can't.
And that's hugely important to know that, someone can't look at you and deem you unfit to vote. So unless a judge has said otherwise, you are allowed to vote. I do want to, just from an NAACP standpoint, throw in that there are issues of voting in terms of people who have a felony record, and that they want to be careful and check to make sure that they are allowed to vote, because there's a process that you now have to go through. So just want to keep that in mind, and for more help with that, they can certainly reach out to us at the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP. And then if your right to vote is challenged, what should you do, Annie?
Well, if someone does challenge your right to vote, you can tell them, like, hey, under Iowa law, I'm still allowed to vote. And if they're like, oh, I still don't know, and they give you a provisional ballot, you can actually, there is a hotline that Disability Rights Iowa and the Iowa Secretary of State are running on Election Day that you can call and be like, hey, someone's trying to deny me my right. This is not okay. And we will do everything we can to make sure that your right is not violated.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think that that's very important to know that we're getting down to, and I think both of you touched on this very well, these are just basic rights. We're getting down to the Voting Rights Act, the amendments, the 64 and 65 Voting Rights Acts, and what we're getting down to is the rights available to some are available to all, not just some. I think it was brought up very well. And Annie, I really appreciate your description of someone not being able to communicate, or someone in a position trying to vote. Perhaps they don't appear as though that they appear like the voting judges at a particular precinct or location. And I think that it comes down to the rights of all are important.
That's a really big thing, because a lot of times poll workers get a little confused if someone has an assistant while they're voting. That is completely legal. Anyone in Iowa, even if you don't have a disability, you have the right to have an assistant while you're voting. You just have to send an affidavit requesting assistance so that it's kept track of and someone knows that you had an assistant, and anyone can have that. I helped my father vote because he was blind, and that's completely legal, and no one can challenge you on that.
David, let's talk about balance, because this is important too.
Sure.
In addition, the NAACP, stood against this voter ID law, but since it did pass, we are, committed to make sure people understand. And one of the things that happened was that straight party voting was taken off basically people can no longer vote straight party. And that's really important for all Iowans. But when you think about people with disabilities and having to kind of go through, it could make it more challenging. And so we just encourage people to realize that you can't just check one box and be done. You really do need to go through the ballot to ensure that you are checking all of the candidates that you would like to see in office. And again, we are both nonpartisan organizations, so we just encourage you to make sure you are familiar with the ballot and then go ahead and vote. And then the other thing to note, and again, because of this ballot situation, that if you make a mistake on your ballot, you have the right and you are able to ask an election official for another ballot. So they can discard that ballot and you can ask for another ballot. And you can do that. You can have up to 3 ballots. So, if you do make a mistake, don't fret. Just ask for another ballot. So, and then also, Annie, let's talk about something that I think a lot of people are not aware of as well when it comes to being able to vote, curbside voting.
Yes. No, we've actually been really excited this year to try and run a big educational campaign on curbside voting, because it's a right for all people with disabilities in Iowa. And we were able to partner with the Secretary of State's office and get a curbside voting sign out to every single precinct in Iowa that will be there on Election Day to let people know that they can call their county auditor when they pull up in their car, and the county auditor will call the polling place and have election officials sent out to your car with a ballot and an affidavit requesting assistance, and you can vote from your car.
And that's important as well. And it's a service that is available to ensure that people who may not, not just physical disabilities, as we were talking about before, but say if someone has an issue with large crowds or noise. Yeah, you may have an animal that assists them, that kind of thing. They are all able to use this curbside vote.
Yeah, so if you have a physical disability or a mental illness, you are allowed to curbside vote. It's kind of a good guideline that I've come up with is if you have an accessible parking lot tag, you can use curbside voting, but also if you have a mental illness. So it can be a temporary physical disability as well. Like my mother just got double knee surgery, so she could use that because she has a temporary accessible parking spot sign. But also if you're a veteran and you have PTSD and you are totally intending to go stand in line and vote, but the crowds and the noise are just too much for you, you can pull up, call that number, or send someone inside the polling place, and you can vote curbside. And it's counted in the same manner. It's a regular ballot. It's not provisional. So you just have to sign an affidavit saying, hey, I'm out here, I'm curbside voting, I do have a physical disability or a mental illness, and I need to curbside vote. And it's counted in the usual manner. There's nothing different about it.
And so when you pull up this number, there will be a sign with this number.
Yes.
So you could call in advance, but you do not have to. Just pull up just as anyone else voting and call the number there, and they will come out if they are not already out. So just as an FYI, not just we'll add for your information, but this is really good information to know. And so those are some of the basics in terms of making sure that you are able to vote. And certainly, if someone challenges your right to vote at any given time, you should report that to the Secretary of State's office, but then also feel free to contact Disability Rights Iowa or the NAACP to address those issues. And if there is, if it comes down to it, ask for a provisional ballot. Make sure that you take this opportunity to vote. And again, just a reminder that, with the polls being open from 7 to 9, if you are in line by 9 p.m., you are allowed to vote. So stand in that line. It is your responsibility. It is your right to vote.
Absolutely. I think that you're touching on some very good points, and some of this information I think our audience is unaware of, because some of this I'm going to tell you I was unaware of until we opened up this can and started this discussion. And I really do appreciate that you've come on the air to talk to us and with us about these issues, because I think it's very important for people to know that they have special rights that we were granted because the United States Congress got together and the president signed laws many years ago. President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act as a law, and we have to abide by this. So there's very basic laws, and it's what's fair for one is fair for all, and I think that's what we're getting down to.
Absolutely. We've come a long way since that 1965 signing of that law. We certainly have had some hiccups along the way, but and then regressed a little bit. But we are here. The best thing we can do is provide the knowledge, and knowledge, that old axiom is power. So knowledge is power. We want to make sure that people are aware of their right to vote, and this is all people. Everyone should have. If you are a citizen, you have the right to vote, and we want to make sure that there are no barriers.
Yeah.
No, the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act grants everyone the right to an accessible voting place and an accessible parking lot. And if that's not the case, let us know, and we will do our best to figure out a solution for you.
Very
Absolutely.
good.
And one more thing, in addition to that, the polling places are also supposed to be voter accessible. So maybe you don't want to do curbside voting. You still can go into the polling place, and it is their responsibility to make sure that you are accommodated. And so that is really something to focus on, too. So however you choose to cast your ballot, you should be able to do that. And again, just a reminder that it doesn't matter if you have not registered in advance, you can register and vote on the same day.
Yep.
Very good. Well, I want to thank both of you for taking time out to be with us on KALA in this nonpartisan discussion about voting rights and the rights that we all have. And I think that this is a relationship and a conversation that's going to continue on KALA, because I know our audience is hungry to learn more information about the rights that we all share. And I'd like to thank Annie Maddie from Disability Rights Iowa. Annie, is there a website people can go to visit and learn more about your organization?
Yeah, there is. It's driowa.org.
driowa.org, and that's how they can find out more about Disability Rights Iowa. Also, thank you to Betty Andrews, who is the president of the State Area Conference of Chapters of the NAACP here in Iowa and Nebraska. And Betty, it's so good to have you on 88.5 KALA.
Absolutely, and you can reach us at Iowa-Nebraska NAACP.org. Thank you so much. And then just the number 515-288-7171. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for being with us on KALA.